So growing up as a kid, I used to love wrestling. Any other wrestling fans out there? You can admit it. Dennis is like, no, absolutely not. It was the best. It was fake. It was wonderful. But my favorite type of wrestling was tag team wrestling. So this morning, you're getting tag team preaching. So we'll see how it works. We've never tried this before, but the journey of this series is really about connecting to the reality that our faith changes over time. All of us have had different experiences of faith from childhood into adulthood. And as we change, as our knowledge and wisdom and stress and anxiety and all of the things that come into life, as those shift with us, so too does God. And it's not that God is a wholly different God. It's that God is meeting us where we're at. And so in different moments, God will meet us in a way that connects us back to him. Because God, at its very core, is all about relationship, right? You can go back to the early parts of Genesis. You can go into the part where God calls Abraham, and he calls Abraham into relationship, but he doesn't just call Abraham into relationship. He calls Abraham to be a people, a community into relationship with him. And so part of what I would like us to do over the next 2 weeks is explore some of that, right? To play with it so that you can begin to identify in your own journey, well, I remember when this happened in my life and I met God anew. And I can name that, right? If you ever want a good picture of this biblically, just read through the Old Testament where every time somebody meets God, they give him a new name, right? Jehovah Jireh, Adonai, right? And it's because as they come into that place with God, the relationship changes and it requires a new name. And so Mike is going to share with you a story from his world where God got a new name.
I was up here for emotional support. and this is the first thing you notice with me and Rustin is I need something to stand behind. So I'm going to move this over here. So, meeting Jesus anew, right? I remember meeting Jesus for the first time as a child, right? My parents weren't religious, but I grew up in a Christian school, okay? So we learned the stories. They were good Baptists, too. So Baptists love to tell the stories of God. They have the flannel graphs and all this stuff, right? And they teach the stories of God. And so I learned about this Jesus guy, this story, about how Jesus loved us and cared for us and was part of our lives. And that Jesus story was a good one. But that's what he was, a story, right? He was that guy that maybe you prayed to when you needed something. He was the guy that was, on the flannel graph that was walking on the water. You're like, well, that's not really water, but it looks cool. He was this Jesus guy who was doing stuff for people, but that's where he remained for me for a long time. And those of you who've been around St. Matthew for a little while, you've maybe heard my testimony about meeting Jesus anew one time where I was in church and I met Jesus and I went through the stages of crying. And if you haven't heard that sermon, one day I'll tell it again. But how I met this Jesus anew in high school where I had to have Jesus become real. I needed him to step out of that story and from the pages in a book into my life. And I met Jesus in this powerfully emotional way where I was literally wailing, crying. It's pretty awesome. And so often the story is this, as us up here that we tell these stories about Jesus, we preach, sometimes we forget in our journey too about this Jesus and who he is and what he's doing in our lives. And so a few weeks ago, a few months ago, I told a story or told the sermon about a person named Hagar. And of course, all of you guys remember that, right? Perfect. Okay. I'll rehash just in case. But Hagar, like Rustin said, was someone that met God and she named God. She's actually one of the first people to really name God. And she gives God this interesting name because she's out in the desert. She's alone. She feels lost and abandoned. Everyone refers to her as slave, but God refers to her by her first name. And she says, this is who I want to call you. This is my name for God. She says, you are a God who sees. And I taught about that story. This was probably during the summer, early summer. And I was like, yes, this God who sees us. Because in my life, I've been in this journey where I feel that God really does see me, right? But again, as often is the case, we preach about things maybe we're still learning or going through, or maybe we forget about. And so in this journey of life that we've gone through, many of you guys know that me and my wife bought a home. And that is like an interesting thing just to do, right, to buy a home. But people often don't ask the question, well, why did you buy a home? Well, maybe it's like, well, that's what you're supposed to do, right? Especially in American culture. That's, if you're successful, that's what you do. Not that I'm successful, but pretty close. But if you were to ask me, why did you buy a home? I would tell you this story. A few months, we've been living, me and my wife were renting a place, and we've been renting a place in Concord for about 7 years. And it was great. It was below market, and so it was super cheap. And we're like, okay, we got to stay here as long as we can because we can afford this. About 6 years into this, or 5 years into this, we have some issues with our landlord. Not that we're having issues with them, but our landlord is married, the married couple. There's a divorce. Before the divorce is finalized, one of them dies, and then there's kids who are in this process who are not the other person's kids, and so who owns the house? And then this person owns the house, so we pay them, but then yet, no, this person owns the house legally, so we pay them. And then in the midst of all of this stuff, yeah, shaking your head, we did a lot of head shaking. In the midst of all of this, me and my wife were like, okay, what's going on here? Then the hard things start happening. Things start breaking. For example, our air conditioner breaks. Yeah, during the summer, while her parents are visiting us. It was awesome. And we go to say, hey, can you fix this? Well, no. Okay, well, it costs too much. Well, you own the house. Then the dishwasher breaks. I was going to write a book one day about how the dishwasher saved my marriage. And because it's just such a handy tool, right? And that breaks. And then all of a sudden, the pipes back up. And our bedroom is flooding. And I get a call from my daughter saying, hey, the house is flooding. I'm like, what? And so I go home, rush home, and all of a sudden, yeah, the house is backing up into our bedroom. Awesome. And so I find, the trap, and I clean it out. And so all this is going on. And we start saying, can we still live here? Things are breaking, falling apart. The house needs care, and no one wants to care for it. We don't have the money to care for it. And so we're like, what do we do? So we start looking for places to rent, right? And any of you who have been looking for places to rent recently or looked at the market, you know that it's extremely expensive. And so as we looked, we knew that we would have to double, if not, do more than that with our monthly rent payment. And we're like, how can we do this? How can we stay in this area? And on top of that, I was a youth pastor for a number of years. My wife was a school teacher at a private Christian school, which means we don't get paid well. And and for literally, okay, we've been married 17 years. For 12 years of our marriage, we literally qualified for low-income housing. Okay, we didn't make much, but we loved what we do, and we still do. And so there is this reality, this financial reality. How can we do this? What do we do, God? God, do you see me still? Matthew, the verse you read, 9:36, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. This Jesus who sees is sometimes a hard Jesus to wrap our heads around, our minds around, because we think in the midst of our troubles, in the midst of our hardships, that Jesus has just somehow wandered off. Does he still see me? Does he still care? There's a lot of other people in this world, God, and my situation is by no means the worst in this world. There are plenty of other situations that are way worse than mine, but God, do you still see me? And so as we began this process of trying to look for a place to live, literally looking for a place to live, we happened upon a house, and the story goes on that we were able to purchase it. And in that story, there's a lot there that I won't get into because I don't have time for it this morning. But there were so many hurdles that seemed impossible. But yet every single one, God was able to help us get over. You guys prayed for us. You guys, it was just incredible. And it reminded me of a sermon, again, that Rustin preached a few weeks back about a little old guy named Zacchaeus, right? And if you read these texts carefully, you see some very interesting things between Zacchaeus and Hagar. In both stories, the crowds and the people refer to, the individuals as what? Slave, woman, that tax collector. They don't want to use their names. But in each story, God meets the individual. And one of the first thing that God literally says is, hey, Hagar. Hey, Zacchaeus. God was still watching. So as I met Jesus and you personally just these few weeks, in this last, we finally made our first mortgage payment. Whew, okay, God's good. God sees you. Jesus sees you. Jesus is the God who sees us.
I talked last week about meeting Jesus as teacher and hearing the kind of prophetic message of Jesus calling us to live in a way, right? The way of Jesus, to follow that way. And those first few years of college, that was enough, man. That kept me busy. It kept me engaged in my faith and living close to this Jesus as I began to listen to his teachings anew with a completely different lens than I had been given as a child. And you've heard me tell the story before about my first engagement with clinical depression. And about 2 years into this Jesus as teacher, I couldn't find my way out of my bed. And Jesus as teacher, while still relevant, wasn't helping me get out of bed and wasn't helping me thrive. And I couldn't find my way out. And I had this friend named Matt. He was my roommate. And Matt would just literally crawl into bed next to me in the morning and he would say, Rustin, you got to get up and go to class. He'd push me out of bed. And I would go to class. And I would come home, and at night, I would just be sitting there and in a mess, and Matt would come up next to me. Well, over the weeks and months that followed that, Matt knew something was going on more than what he or I could handle, especially with kind of the conservative frame around mental health that we had been handed in our childhood. And so he called his friend, his mentor, his youth group leader, not his youth pastor, the volunteer, the one that was with him from 6th grade through 12th grade. And not a young college guy, but a man with wisdom. Not that young college guys can't have wisdom. And Jeff, who had become a friend of mine as well, got in his car and drove 2.5 hours north to meet me at our apartment when I got home from school. And he spent an entire weekend with us. And this is when I began to meet Jesus as friend. Friend, it seems like a really gentle way of understanding Jesus. Yet it surprises me how often I hear it mocked in our churches and in our culture. I hear people, and I've even said it, man, some of these worship songs are like boyfriend Jesus songs. Like, that's a bad thing. Like, we can't remember that first love when we fell in love for the first time and connect with Jesus in that way. I've heard theologians and pastors stand at pulpits and mock friendship Jesus as a juvenile way of looking at the Christ and calling us to have a more mature faith. But see, friendship with God is not a biblical side story. It's central to the promises and the faithfulness of being called God's family, in which all friends and companions and intimates and siblings are beloved. In fact, if you watch Jesus in the early days, early Christians who, most of whom were Jews, knew all of this, and they extended the idea of divine friendship to Jesus. And the New Testament vividly recounts the closeness of Jesus' circle of friends. In fact, it even talks about like best friend circles, right? Frequently, you hear John boasting, well, I'm the beloved, right? I'm Jesus' bestie. And then you have the inner three of Peter, James, and John. And then you have the 12, and then you have the 72, and then you have the thousands that are gathered around Jesus, but all connecting themselves to Christ in friendship. I taught at our synagogue, not our synagogue, but our partner synagogue on Friday, and I had a couple come up and talk to me after the service, and they were talking about, as adults, how hard it is to make friends, right? As kids, you just put a kid in a dirt patch, and they're like, hey, you want to be my friend? But if you do that as an adult, people are like, that guy's weird, right? So somewhere along this line of friendship and in our reality, we teach our kids, you need to be a good friend, you need to make friends, you need to go out and connect, and we long for that. In fact, when my kids aren't making friends the first few weeks of school, like Hazel, as she started kindergarten, every day we ask her, can you tell me a name of one friend? She's like, no, Dad. And I'm like, just tell me one name. Now she's coming back 2 weeks in, and she's like naming the friends that she has, because I was anxious about whether or not she was making friends. But I think many of us, as adults, walk through life trying to find friends. We don't even know how to do it anymore. We don't know how to connect in this way. Jesus says, this is my command, that you love one another as I've loved you. You are my friends if you do what I command. I'm not sure if I ever knew what to do with those words of Jesus. You're my friends if you do what I command. It sounds conditional. Because what kind of friendship is that if you require something of me? But friendship is contingent upon love. Right? It's a part of it. We make friends because we love each other. Real love, compassion, empathy, reaching out, going beyond what we imagine is possible. That this command to love, if we reach out and love, friendship is the result, even friendship with God. And friendship is a mutual interplay, right? The word we use for Trinity comes from this word parakoesis, where we get the word choreography. It's this dance. You can imagine three people whirling together in this relational harmony and movement and connecting. This is the idea from the very foundation of God in creation. Now, I didn't meet Jesus as a friend through the Bible. That may feel a little blasphemous to you, but just hold on for a minute. I met Jesus as friend through Matt and Jeff. And as I was getting the help I needed, and Matt and Jeff were there with me, not judging me, but holding me in respect and love and walking alongside me in this, it was Jesus in the midst of that I was connecting to. And for a while, I didn't see that. I just saw friends. But when my mind started clearing from the fog and my serotonin was replaced by good medication and friendship, I came on the other side and I was able to proclaim, that was you, Jesus. Right? This is why meeting Jesus anew matters. It's not some game or trick. It's relationship. Right? And while we're spending 3 weeks on this, the truth is we have a covert plan. We don't preach from the traditional lectionary, you might have noticed. But we write our own every year. And so I can tell you where we're going to be in November, in December, in January, in February, in March, all the way into the summer. And every year we pick a singular theme that we think we as a community need to double down on. And our theme for this year is, who is St. Matthew in relationship to Jesus? But St. Matthew is you. It's us, but it's more you. And so how you're meeting Jesus determines how we're in relationship to Jesus as a congregation. How you're meeting Jesus will determine how our neighborhood is meeting Jesus. How we're meeting Jesus will determine how the world is meeting Jesus. And there's nothing more important. And so Mike and I challenge you by telling our stories, not to let our stories be the only stories we tell this month. Be bold. Be courageous. Be like the little kid playing in the dirt, and be bold enough to invite somebody sitting next to you to coffee or to lunch or to a beer or whatever it is that you do. Because it's okay, church, that we talk about how we're meeting Jesus. And it is also okay, church, to say, I haven't met Jesus anew in a really long time and it's freaking me out. And I feel very alone. Because that's part of how we meet Jesus. Please pray with us. God, the only thing that we want, at least Mike and I in this moment, is for people to be connected to you. To know that they're seen. To know that we matter to you. God, there are tons of people in this room and in our world who are craving a house. They're craving companionship. That are craving to be seen. We ask that they would see you. We ask that you would do all in your power for them to feel and to touch and to know that you love them. That you call them friend. And God, we ask that we would be the type of friends in our neighborhood and in our work and in our homes that awaken people to your love. In your name we pray. Amen.